Conclusion: the verdict of history. What does the evidence establish, and what does it mean today? On a November afternoon in 1981, I locked myself in my bedroom and spent hours replaying the spiritual journey I had been traveling for 21 months. I never intended to write about my experience. In fact, it would be years later when I would decide to retrace and expand upon my original investigation by traveling the country to interview scholars for this book. Still, my probe from January the 20th, 1980 to November 8, 1981 had been thorough and exhilarating. I had studied history, sifted archaeology, asked questions, and analyzed answers with as much of an open mind as I could muster. Now I had reached critical mass. The evidence seemed clear. The only remaining issue was what I would do with it. Pulling out a yellow legal pad, I began listing the questions I had posed as I embarked on my investigation, as well as the key facts I had uncovered. In a similar way, I can sum up the substance of what we've learned in our examination of the evidence through the experts in this book. Can the biographies of Jesus be trusted? I once thought the Gospels were merely religious propaganda, hopelessly tainted by overactive imaginations and evangelistic zeal. However, Craig Blomberg, one of the country's foremost authorities on the topic, built a convincing case that they reflect direct and indirect eyewitness testimony and bear the unmistakable earmarks of accuracy. So early are these biographies that they cannot be explained away as merely being a legendary invention. In fact, the fundamental beliefs in Jesus' miracles, resurrection, and deity go way back to the very dawning of the Christian movement. Do the biographies of Jesus stand up to scrutiny? Blomberg argued persuasively that the gospel writers intended to preserve reliable history, were able to do so, were honest and willing to include difficult-to-explain material, and didn't allow bias to unduly color their reporting. The harmony among the Gospels on essential facts, coupled with divergence on some details, lends historical credibility to the accounts. What's more, the early church couldn't have taken root and flourished right there in Jerusalem if it had been teaching facts about Jesus that his own contemporaries could have exposed as exaggerated or false. In short, the Gospels were able to pass all 8 evidential tests. Were Jesus' biographies reliably preserved for us? World-class scholar Bruce Metzger said that compared with other ancient documents, there is an unprecedented number of New Testament manuscripts, and that they can be dated extremely close to the original writings. None of the textual variants, which tend to be minor spelling and grammatical differences, put any major Christian doctrines in doubt. The criterion used by the early church to determine which books should be considered authoritative have ensured that we possess the best records about Jesus. Is there credible evidence for Jesus outside his biographies? We have better historical documentation for Jesus than for the founder of any other ancient religion, said Edwin Yamauchi. Sources from outside the Bible corroborate that many people believe Jesus performed healings and was the Messiah, that he was crucified, and that despite his shameful death, his followers, who believed he was still alive, worshipped him as God. One expert documented 39 ancient sources that corroborate more than 100 facts concerning Jesus' life, teachings, crucifixion, and resurrection. 7 secular sources and several early creeds concern the deity of Jesus, a doctrine definitely present in the earliest church, according to scholar Gary Habermas. Does archaeology confirm or contradict Jesus' biographies? Archaeologist John McRay said there's no question that archaeological findings have enhanced the New Testament's credibility. No discovery has ever disproved a biblical reference. Further, archaeology has established that Luke, who wrote about 1/4 of the New Testament, was an especially careful historian. Concluded one expert, If Luke was so painstakingly accurate in his historical reporting of minor details, on what logical basis may we assume that he was credulous or inaccurate in his reporting of matters that were far more important, not only to him, but to others as well? Like, for instance, the resurrection of Jesus. Is the Jesus of history the same as the Jesus of faith? Gregory Boyd said the much-publicized Jesus Seminar, which doubts Jesus said most of what's attributed to him, was made up of an extremely small number of radical fringe scholars who are on the far, far left wing of New Testament thinking. The seminar ruled out the possibility of miracles at the outset. It employed questionable criteria, and some participants have touted myth-riddled documents of extremely dubious quality. Further, the idea that stories about Jesus emerge from mythology about God's dying and rising fails to withstand scrutiny. Said Boyd, "The evidence for Jesus being who the disciples said he was is just light years beyond my reasons for thinking that the left-wing scholarship of the Jesus Seminar is correct." In sum, the Jesus of faith is the same as the Jesus of history. Was Jesus really convinced that he was the Son of God? By going back to the very earliest traditions, which are unquestionably safe from legendary development, Ben Witherington III was able to show that Jesus had a supreme and transcendent self-understanding. Based on the evidence, Witherington said, "Did Jesus believe he was the Son of God, the Anointed One of God? The answer is yes. Did he see himself as the Son of Man? The answer is yes. Did he see himself as the final Messiah? Yes, that's the way he viewed himself. Did he believe that anybody less than God could save the world? No, I don't believe he did." Was Jesus crazy when he claimed to be the Son of God? Well-known psychologist Gary Collins said Jesus exhibited no inappropriate emotions, was in contact with reality, was brilliant and had amazing insights into human nature, and enjoyed deep and abiding relationships. "I just don't see signs that Jesus was suffering from any known mental illness," he concluded. In addition, Jesus backed up his claim to being God through miraculous feats of healing, astounding demonstrations of power over nature, unrivaled teaching, divine understanding of people, and with his own resurrection, which was the final authentication of his identity. Did Jesus fulfill the attributes of God? While the incarnation, God becoming man, the infinite becoming finite, stretches our imagination, prominent theologian D.A. Carson pointed out that there's lots of evidence that Jesus exhibited the characteristics of deity. Based on Philippians 2, many theologians believe Jesus voluntarily emptied himself of the independent use of these divine attributes as he pursued his mission of human redemption. Even so, the New Testament specifically confirms that Jesus ultimately possessed every qualification of deity, including omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, eternality, and immutability. Did Jesus and Jesus alone match the identity of the Messiah? Hundreds of years before Jesus was born, prophets foretold the coming of the Messiah, or the Anointed One, who would redeem God's people. In effect, dozens of these Old Testament prophecies created a fingerprint that only the true Messiah could fit. This gave Israel a way to rule out impostors and validate the credentials of the authentic Messiah. Against astronomical odds, one chance in a trillion, 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 trillion. Jesus, and only Jesus throughout history, matched this prophetic fingerprint. This confirms Jesus' identity to an incredible degree of certainty. Was Jesus' death a sham and his resurrection a hoax? By analyzing the medical and historical data, Dr. Alexander Metherow concluded Jesus could not have survived the gruesome rigors of crucifixion, much less the gaping wound that pierced his lung and heart. The idea that he somehow swooned on the cross and pretended to be dead lacks any evidential basis. Roman executioners were grimly efficient, knowing that they themselves would face death if any of their victims were to come down from the cross alive. Even if Jesus had somehow lived through the torture, his ghastly condition could never have inspired a worldwide movement based on the premise that he had gloriously triumphed over the grave. Was Jesus' body really absent from his tomb? William Lane Craig presented striking evidence that the enduring symbol of Easter, the vacant tomb of Jesus, was a historical reality. The empty grave is reported or implied in extremely early sources, Mark's Gospel and the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed, which date so close to the event that they could not possibly have been the products of legend. The fact that the Gospels report that women discovered the empty tomb bolsters the story's authenticity. The site of Jesus' tomb was known to both Christian and Jew alike, so it could have been checked by skeptics. In fact, nobody, not even the Roman authorities or Jewish leaders, ever claimed that the tomb still contained Jesus' body. Instead, they were forced to invent the absurd story that the disciples, despite having no motive or opportunity, had stolen the body, a theory that not even the most skeptical critic believes today. Was Jesus seen alive after his death on the cross? The evidence for the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus didn't develop gradually over the years as mythology distorted memories of his life. Rather, said resurrection expert Gary Habermas, the resurrection was the central proclamation of the early church from the very beginning. The ancient creed from 1 Corinthians 15 mentions individuals and groups who encountered the risen Christ, and Paul even challenged first-century doubters to talk with these witnesses personally to determine the truth of the matter for themselves. The book of Acts is littered with extremely early affirmations of Jesus' resurrection, while the Gospels describe numerous encounters in detail. Concluded British theologian Michael Green, the appearances of Jesus are as well authenticated as anything in antiquity. There could be no rational doubt that they occurred. Are there any supporting facts that point to the resurrection? J.P. Moreland's circumstantial evidence added final documentation for the resurrection. First, the disciples were in a unique position to know whether the resurrection happened, and they were willing to endure suffering and deprivation, proclaiming it was true. Second, apart from the resurrection, there's no good reason why skeptics like Paul and James would have been converted and would have died for their faith. Nobody knowingly and willingly dies for a lie. Third, within weeks of the crucifixion, thousands of Jews began abandoning key social practices that had critical sociological and religious importance for centuries. They believed they risked damnation if they were wrong. Fourth, the early sacraments of communion and baptism affirmed Jesus' resurrection and deity. And fifth, the miraculous emergence of the church in the face of brutal Roman persecution rips a great hole in history, a hole the size and shape of resurrection, as C.F.D. Moulet put it. I'll admit it. I was ambushed by the amount and quality of the evidence that Jesus is the unique Son of God. As I sat in my room that Sunday afternoon, I shook my head in amazement. I had seen defendants carted off to the death chamber on much less convincing proof. The cumulative facts and data pointed unmistakably toward a conclusion that I wasn't entirely comfortable in reaching. Frankly, I had wanted to believe that the deification of Jesus was the result of legendary development, in which well-meaning but misguided people slowly turned a wise sage into the mythological Son of God. That seemed safe and reassuring. After all, a roving apocalyptic preacher from the first century could make no demands on me. But while I went into my investigation thinking that this legendary explanation was intuitively obvious, I emerged convinced it was totally without basis. What clinched it for me was the comment by A.N. Sherwin-White, the great classical historian from Oxford University, that William Lane Craig alluded to in our interview. Sherwin-White understood the rate at which legend accrued in the ancient world. His conclusion? Not even 2 full generations was enough time for legend to develop and to wipe out a solid core of historical truth. Now, consider the case of Jesus. Historically speaking, the news of his empty tomb, the eyewitness accounts of his post-resurrection appearances, and the conviction that he was indeed God's unique Son emerged virtually instantaneously. The 1 Corinthians 15 creed, affirming Jesus' death for our sins and listing his post-resurrection appearances to named eyewitnesses within months after the crucifixion. Mark's account of the empty tomb was drawn from material that dates back to within a few years of the event itself. The Gospels, attesting to Jesus' teachings, miracles, and resurrection, were circulating within the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries, who would have been all too glad to set the record straight if there had been embellishment or falsehood. The most primitive Christian hymns affirm Jesus' divine nature. Blomberg summed it up this way. Within the first 2 years after his death, then, significant numbers of Jesus' followers seem to have formulated a doctrine of the atonement, were convinced that he had been raised from the dead in bodily form, associated Jesus with God, and they believed they found support for all these convictions in the Old Testament. Concluded William Lane Craig, the time span necessary for significant accrual of legend concerning the events of the Gospels would place us in the 2nd century A.D., just the time, in fact, when the legendary apocryphal Gospels were born. These are the legendary accounts sought by the critics. There was simply nowhere near enough time for mythology to thoroughly corrupt the historical record of Jesus, especially in the midst of eyewitnesses who still had personal knowledge of him. When German theologian Julius Müller in 1844 challenged anyone to find a single example of legend developing that fast anywhere in history, the response from the scholars of his day and to the present time was resounding silence. On November the 8th, 1981, I realized that my biggest